What if everything you thought you knew about the Crusades was a lie? What if I told you that the greatest religious war in Western history wasn't really about faith, or God, or the Holy Land? What if the real reason, hidden beneath centuries of sermons, papal decrees, and blood-soaked banners, was something far more human, something darker? Not divine righteousness, but power, greed, politics. This is the story of how religion became a mask, and behind it, the brutal truth that few dare to speak. The Crusades were sold as a sacred mission, a holy cause, a battle between the forces of light and darkness. Christian knights from across Europe were told to take up the cross, travel thousands of miles, and liberate Jerusalem from the so-called infidels. They were promised salvation, eternal paradise, forgiveness of every sin they had ever committed. But what history books often gloss over, what the church rarely acknowledged, was what was happening behind the curtain, in the chambers of kings and the halls of the Vatican. Let's rewind to the late 11th century. Europe was a land fractured by chaos, lords warring with lords, peasants suffering under famine and overpopulation. The economy was straining, and the church, despite its influence, was fighting for control against the power of monarchs and the growing independence of local rulers. And far to the east, the Byzantine Empire was crumbling. The Muslim Seljuk Turks had pushed deep into Christian territory. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, desperate, sent a plea to the west, not for a holy war but for mercenaries, reinforcements. What he got was something else entirely, because when Pope Urban II received that call, he didn't just see a chance to help a Christian emperor. He saw an opportunity. He stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont in 1095, raised his hand to the heavens, and proclaimed a holy crusade, a righteous war to reclaim the Holy Land. He painted horrifying images of Christians being tortured in Jerusalem, churches defiled, pilgrims slaughtered. But the truth? Most of those stories were exaggerated or completely fabricated. Why? Because Pope Urban needed to redirect the chaos of Europe outward. He needed to unite the warring lords under a single cause, his cause. A common enemy, Crusade. And the Holy Land? It was the perfect symbol. Distant, spiritual, drenched in biblical lore, and far enough away that those who marched wouldn't come back to challenge his authority. What followed was unprecedented. Tens of thousands answered the call. Not just knights and nobles, but peasants, beggars, merchants, entire families. Many of them weren't driven by faith. They were driven by desperation, by poverty, by the promise of land, wealth, and status. Because here's the part often left out of religious sermons. Joining the crusade wasn't just about saving your soul. It was about social mobility. Crusaders were promised not just forgiveness but freedom from debts, legal immunity, a place in a new world carved from the east. It was colonization dressed in the robes of religion. And behind the scenes, kings and nobles saw the same opportunity. A chance to expand their power, to seize trade routes, to gain land in a region that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was never just about Jerusalem. It was about control of the Silk Road, ports on the Mediterranean, access to spices, gold, and influence. That's why, even after Jerusalem fell in 1099, after a massacre so brutal that Christian chroniclers described rivers of blood, the Crusades didn't stop. They kept going, for centuries, because the Holy War had become an empire-building machine. The Crusader states, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, weren't spiritual havens. They were military colonies, ruled by feudal lords, built on oppression, taxation, and exploitation of local populations. Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians, all were second-class citizens under Crusader rule. Religion had become a weapon, a justification, a brand, and those who wielded it knew exactly what they were doing. Even the church grew rich from the war. Donations poured in from across Europe. Land was transferred. Wealth was hoarded. Entire orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers emerged, religious on the surface, but financially and politically powerful underneath. They built fortresses, minted coins, loaned money to kings, and eventually they became so powerful, they had to be destroyed. Ask yourself, if the Crusades were only about religion, why did Christian armies sack Christian cities? Like Constantinople in 1204, when Crusaders, instead of fighting Muslims, turned on their own allies in the Byzantine Empire, looting churches, killing civilians, and crowning their own emperor. It wasn't a war of faith. It was a war of opportunity. Religion was just the rallying cry. The reality was that the Crusades were a convenient storm, a way to export violence, expand wealth, and consolidate power under the guise of holiness. And this strategy didn't end in the medieval world. It became a blueprint. For centuries, empires and institutions would repeat the pattern. Wrap conquest in faith, hide ambition beneath divine purpose, frame invasion as salvation. But the blood on the ground always told the real story. So when we look back at the Crusades, we must strip away the stained glass, the romantic tales, the noble myths. We must see them for what they were: brutal, calculated, and deeply human. Because the real reason for the Crusades wasn't religion. It was control. And religion was just the perfect excuse. Now here's the part that should make you uneasy. This pattern hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. Today, wars are still fought with sacred language. Politicians still invoke God. Borders are still drawn in the name of righteousness. But behind the curtains, the motives remain the same: power, resources, territory. So perhaps the most dangerous lie of all is not the story we tell about the Crusades, but the belief that we've learned anything from them. Because as long as people are willing to kill for what they think is holy, there will always be those in power willing to tell them it is. And history will keep repeating itself, unless we finally learn to question the banner before we march beneath it.